Hi, I'm Gary Strigler, and today I want to share with you one of the most popular door styles that I build. Now, I'm kind of known for being a simple guy, so what I like about this door is if you're a carpenter or woodworker at all, you probably have got all the tools that you need to build this door, and when we get done, hopefully you're going to look at it and go, hey, that's a really good looking door. One thing I want to share right up front is I've been doing woodworking about 55 years now. So anytime that I teach or share something, I want to say, if you see me doing something and you're not comfortable doing it, there's always another way of doing it. So I want to share the way I would do it, and hopefully that will work for you, but if not, there's always another way of doing it. And I want to try to even share, hey, here's the alternate ways of doing it. But again, this is a way to make a great looking cabinet door just using tools you already own. So building these cabinet doors is sort of a two-part thing. Now, it's a mitered corner door, which is really a great thing because when you do a mitered corner door, there's no end grain showing. It's basically like putting together a picture frame. It also allows us to do some profiles and things that we couldn't do with a butt joint. So the first part of the process is actually making the frame, the molding that's going to go around the panel inside. I pretty much always use just a flat plywood panel. Now, so that I don't forget, I want to mention that, plywood, a 1/4-inch plywood panel can vary quite a bit. So you want to make sure that you put the groove in the edge of this molding to fit whatever kind of panel you're going to use. I mean, you can even use like a 1/2-inch thick MDF panel, which gives you a little more robust panel. But first of all, the most challenging thing that we're going to do is put a bead around the outside of our molding. This is the router bit that we're going to do that. It's a white side router bit. The challenging part about this cut is the only way I can make the cut I want is by letting the router ride on the edge of the wood. Now, I'm going to back up for a second and mention also, whenever you're building cabinet doors, you want to pick your very straightest material for the doors. The pieces for the face frame and anything else you do, you get to attach them to something to straighten them out. So what you want to do when you build a door, like if this was the face frame of the cabinet, you want to build the door in such a way that if it has any bow at all, it's going to make contact with the face frame here and there. And if it's away from the face frame a little bit in the middle, that's okay. But you also, this is getting a little more technical, after you built your door, when you get ready to put the hinges on it, you always want to put the hinges, again, if you look at both sides of the door, put the hinges on the side that's got the most bow. Again, hopefully there's not much, but put the hinges on the side that's got the bow. But that's kind of getting way on down the line, but I wanted to mention that right now. So I've got 2 pieces of wood here that I prepped. They are 2 3/4 inches wide, and I've gotten them, I actually ran them through a sander, but you can run them through like a planer. You may even buy what they call S4S stock, but these are 2 3/4 wide, and for some of the ways that we want to make the joints, that 2 3/4 is kind of important, but that's a little bit later on. Now, you could also make this cut that I'm getting ready to show on a router table, but for me, the challenge to that is making a bead. You absolutely have to have it pushed perfectly against the fence and perfectly flat, and wood's not always that way. Because this bit has this undercut, if I bobble any up or down, I've made a part that's going to have to be defect cut out. So I like to use this small base router because if I do keep it flat on the edge of the wood, it's going to pretty much conform to the edge. One of the things that I do to make it easier is I always run 2 pieces at a time because that gives me about 1.5 inches for my router base to sit on. Again, I've been using routers for over 50 years, so if you need to do it, you want to do it, you're more comfortable doing it on a router table, that's fine. But it is important also that you do your machining steps on this in order. And the hardest one, the most important one to do is this edge treatment. So I'm going to set up and make that cut first, and I'll show you what that looks like. I've got these pieces paired together. this is a great exaggeration, but they're kind of like that, so that I'm going to be able to do the face to will have that slight bow the way that I showed you it needs to be. So I'm going to make sure that I keep the router base flat on here. Now remember that this surface needs to be really, flat and good, because the bearing's what's going to guide my cut. So, any bump that's on this face is going to show up in my profile. And, the good news is if you make a little boo-boo, you can always defect cut it out. You just don't want to have too much to defect cut out. All right, so, by the way, when you're using one of these routers, the lower you hold it, the greater control that you have. And the only thing is you don't want to get your finger in there. All right, well, I'm going to get started right now. So that's the first step, this really nice bead. That's the outside edge of my cabinet door. I'm going to turn around and do the edge of my other piece. Now, if I was going to do a whole bunch of these doors, I'd probably set up a little bit more of a jig, like a stop block on this end to hold against the pieces while I'm cutting. And I could even on this wood table, like screw, something like this down the whole length, so I didn't have to worry about it going that direction. I'm pretty comfortable for just doing a little bit, just holding it with my hand. But again, I've kind of spent a whole life working with routers. So that's the outside edge. Now for the inside edge, I'm going to use this bit, which is basically, it's another white side bit. It's, I believe, a 1/4 inch radius. I've got it set up for a little bit of a shoulder. And I'm sitting there thinking I might fine tune that just a tiny bit, because I want to have a shoulder. And by the way, the material that I'm working with here is about 13/16 thick. If you can buy material and get it, clean on both faces to 13/16, it'll make your job a little bit easier. But if all you can get is 3/4, you can make that work too. Anything under 3/4, and it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So this cut is much easier because I get to hold my router flat. Now, one of the things I want to check is, okay, great. So I don't have to worry about my bearing hitting the table. So I can, have these boards anywhere in here. Same thing, I'm going to get that low grip. I'm going to keep this flat. This is a cut that if I did end up with a little bit of a problem or something, I'd probably be comfortable running it a second time to clean it up. I would never do that on that bead. Now the real test is I want to kind of run my finger along this edge, and it's really, really slight, but I can feel just a couple little bumps. Now, those don't seem like a lot now, but once you paint or stain this, they're really going to show up. So I'm just going to run this again for a light pass. That feels a lot better this time. That's what I want. It's like if I close my eyes, I couldn't feel any bumps, and that's what you're looking for. We'll spin this around to the other piece. This is the profile of our molding that we're going to miter around the panel. And again, could even be a raised panel if you want to, but almost always when I make these, I use a flat panel. But the next thing we've got to do is now put a groove in this edge to accept that plywood panel. There's two different ways that I do that. Sometimes I just go to a table saw and set the table saw up and make a curve with the table saw. And that's a pretty safe way to do it as long as your material is fairly flat. Generally speaking, you want that groove to be deep enough, about a ½ inch deep, so the panel has plenty of room in there with maybe a little bit of room for expansion, and loose enough to where the panel will slide in there without you having to beat on it, but not too loose because you don't want it rattling around. Now, another way to do that is with this, which is a slot cutting bit, and this is set up from the bearing to the outside. It's going to be a ½ inch. The bearing, the reason we want to do this last, the bearing's got to have something to ride on here, but if I cut that slot before I made this round over cut, it's possible that the bearing for my round over cut wouldn't have anything to ride on. So I'm going to set this up, and by the way, one of my personal campaigns in life is for everybody to have a D-handle router. This router is so easy to use, but my favorite thing is that's what turns it on and off. So I'm never fumbling around trying to find the on-off switch, and also I've just got so much control holding it like that. Now, the bad news is I'm pretty sure on this the bearing would hit the table, or the screw would hit the table as I go. So I'm going to have to make sure that I keep the edge of the wood out past the table. Again, if I was doing a lot of this, I'd probably set up some kind of jig. It's going to be a little bit awkward, but I'm going to try to hold this. Maybe I can do it like this. So that is not where I want the groove. I want to leave a tiny bit of a shoulder after this rounds over, a tiny bit of a shoulder, almost matching the shoulder that I've got there. And again, because this is 13/16, I've got a little better chance to do that. And this particular cutter that I've got is a little under 1/4, maybe 3/16. Again, almost all 1/4-inch plywood really isn't 1/4. So I don't think I'd want to do this with one of the cutters that cuts 1/4 inch, because my panels would just be really sloppy. I'm going to take this down some and hold up here again to check it. I think that's going to work for me. So I'm going to do a little bit of a test cut first. Of course, unlike those cordless routers, this one I got to plug in. So give me just a second. And I'm just going to do, just an inch or two to see what it looks like. Okay, that groove is just what I want. I've got the round over plus a little bit of short. I'm going to have to make a second pass to come down a little bit to get 1/4 inch ply in there, but not much. I'd have to do the same thing on a table saw. But again, I don't really want to use that 1/4 inch cutter, else my panels would be really sloppy. Although I do have a fix for that. If you end up with a sloppy panel, I'll try to remember to share that at the end. The reason I know all those fixes is because I've made all those mistakes. So don't be discouraged if something doesn't turn out perfect the first time. Mine almost never does. All right. Let's go ahead and run this. So, by the way, the best practice anytime you're using a router, kind of tries your patience a little bit, but the safest thing to do is to leave the router sitting on the workpiece until it stops turning. You know, the good news is this router cord doesn't have a nick, but if you walk through my whole shop and looked at all my routers, you'd find several of them have a nick just about right there. So best practice, just go ahead and keep it on there, wait a second, and you won't be having to replace router cords. So I had a little bit, there's a little rough at the end. As long as I keep the router base flat, I can go back and run it again and clean that up. Okay, the next thing I want to do, and I actually should have already had this here, I'm going to jump over there real quick, find my piece of 1/4-inch plywood that I want to use so I can fine tune that cut. So I got my plywood panel, I checked. I really only need about a 30-second more added to that groove. So I've adjusted my router just slightly, and I'm just gonna make a little test cut. Let's see. That is about how you want to go in. I mean, it's sliding in without me having to fight it too much, but it's not wobbly. So I'm going to stay with that. I wish I could say that I always got it right, you know, the first time I set up. But again, it's better to be cautious, do a little bit of a test and see how the panel's going to fit. If I did happen to have some place that was a tiny bit tight, I could always sand a little bit off the back, but I think this is going to work. So I'm going to set my plywood panel aside, get back over here and finish these two pieces. Okay, just to double check, I'm going to see if that whole piece of plywood will fit in the groove. Got one spot that's a tiny bit tight, but generally speaking, I think that's right where I want to be. And you know, I said this is 13/16 inch thick material. You can see right here I've got almost a 1/4 inch left on the back, and so if this was 3/4 inch material, I would still have enough left to hold that panel in, but it wouldn't be quite as good. So, you know, 13/16 kind of gives me some forgiveness. If you're working with 3/4 inch material, you have to be a little bit more careful. But anyway, you can make it work either way. So the next thing I've got to do, again, this frame door is very much like making a picture frame or a mirror frame. I've got to cut 4 sides. Now, the doors that I make are generally designed to lap over the opening about a 1/2 inch all the way around. And I use European hinges that are pretty adjustable, pretty forgiving. So I need to measure the size opening that I want, and then what's going to be really, really key is I've got to have a miter saw that cuts accurately, but also I need a stop to make sure that the 2 sides are exactly the same length and the top and bottom are the same length. And Also a big fan of using a really good blade to get a clean cut. I'm a big believer in using the Mitering saw blade. So I'm going to step over, take a measurement on the size of the door, and then I'm going to get to the miter saw and start making the cuts. As I get older, I find it's a lot better idea to sometimes write down the measurements that I need than to trust my memory. The particular door that I want is going to be 22 inches tall, 14 inches wide. Now, if I was doing a whole bunch of cabinets or even a pair of doors, you would certainly want to cut all of your long pieces first and then go back and cut the cross piece, because the height of all of them should be exactly the same. Another thing that I'm a big believer in is I don't want to be sitting here moving my saw back and forth 100 times. So I believe in making all of my miters on one side first, then moving the saw one time and making the other cuts. Also, because I'm right-handed, I'm a lot more comfortable holding my left hand and cutting with my right hand. So I'm going to make all these left-hand miters first, and I'm going to move the saw one time and set up and cut the right-hand miters. So first of all, and by the way, you always want to keep your hands at least 3 inches away from the blade, but you have to make sure that your molding you're cutting is in good contact with the fence. Make sure there's no dirt or dust there, because you'd be amazed how just the smallest amount will really make a mess. By the way, this saw happens to have a light that shows me right where the blade's cut. Now, that's a great feature too. Again, the best practice is to leave that saw all the way down until the blade starts spinning. Don't always do that, but that's the best practice. Now, I need 22-inch pieces. So what I'm going to do for right now is I'm going to mark that 22. And I'm going to use the stop that I have over here to cut something slightly longer than 22. And that's so important to me on almost any of the work I do, to have a stop that I can really set up, a hard stop that won't move. So my other dimension's 14. So I'm now going to mark 14. And another thing I want to point out too, some people might say I'm cutting cross-armed, but I've turned my body around to where this arm is basically lined up with the blade and over 3 inches away. So this is a safe way to make the cut, even though it may look a little strange. And again, like when I made those 22-inch cuts, I mean, I might have been making 20 of those, so that's why you want to set up a stop. Setting the stop up may not make quite as much sense when you're only doing a few. But anyway, I'm going to do it. So there's that. I can put a couple of smaller pocket screws in there using the Craig micro jig, and I'm going to demonstrate that on one part of this. The fastest, easiest way to do it is using this machine, which is the Hoffman machine. This is an older machine. To be truthful, they no longer make this. But they make bigger versions of it, which are even more expensive. It's kind of an expensive machine, but I've always been a tool buying fool, so of course I own two. But if you don't want to invest, it's a sizable amount. I'm going to say the starting point on this is maybe $2,400. I do still have hopes that someday someone's going to come up with a jig or something that will make this joint much more economical, but this is what you've got. Let me flip it around there so you see. It's basically a dovetail key that goes into the back of the wood. This machine, when I do this, makes a cut into the back of it, and then when you drive that key in, it pulls the joint together. I mean, it's a fabulous way of doing it. This is pretty much designed for picture frame shops, and so you might even check, if you decide you're going to do a bunch of these, you might even like go to someone's got a picture frame shop and say, hey, can I pay you $100 to do these or whatever. Of course, the Craig Micro Jig is a good way of doing it. We're going to demonstrate that. Not a lot of money. You do have to plug the holes unless you're not real picky. All right, first off, let me just show you how this machine works. One of the things I've learned over time is always do a test cut first. One time I had been doing something, I didn't do the test cut, and the bit came all the way up through the top of the material. Not a good look. All right. So that's the joint, and I'll even slide this in there. At least I think I will. So that's how the joint is made. I didn't put that all the way in, but those do a fantastic job of pulling the joint together. So what I need to do now, again, I'm going to kind of get lazy. I'm going to put together at least 3 of the corners using this Hoffman jig. So I need to have a plan. I'm going to mark which ones get the Hoffman keys and then mark the one that I'm going to put together with the micro jig. So let's see. So I'll mark that one, this one, and maybe this one. And then we'll put the other one, we'll put the other joint together using the Craig Micro Jig. Before I start putting things together, of course, you need to have your panel sized. And I always try and think of the simplest, easiest way to do things. This groove is a 1/2 inch deep, so I want to have the panel go in about 7/16, between 3/8 and 7/16 all the way around. With a plywood panel, I can basically just take my tape measure, hold it in place, and this is going to be, I'm not going to get it exact, but if I hold 7/8 right here, and then read down here, in essence, that's going to give me the length of panel. So it's going to be kind of awkward, but it's about 17 7/16 for the height of the panel. And I just take, same process here, hold 7/8 on this short point and read down here to get the width. Now, because I generally have lots of 1/4 inch plywood around my shop, I'm using a 1/4 inch, well, again, it's not a full 1/4 inch, but a 1/4 inch plywood panel. It paints pretty well. It's got a little bit of movement. Another good option is to get tempered masonite. Now, don't get untempered, but tempered masonite because it's rigid. And you can use that. Now, to be honest, I don't know whether that masonite's a full 1/4 inch or not. Just always check. If you're looking for do more work, this is also an option. This is a piece of 1/2 inch MDF that basically has the raised panel, a raised panel cut on it. So if you look at the end, that's been dropped, so that's not a great example. But from here to here, we've got a 1/4 inch, so you need to make the 1/4 inch cut. But this does give you a 1/2 inch thick panel, so it's going to be a little bit more rigid. You know, that's what you'd see basically. It won't go in that groove because it's not 1/4 inch, but that's what you'd see on the back side. Again, you can do this with 1/2 inch MDF. Most of the time, I just go ahead and use the 1/4 inch plywood. So, but again, if you want a stiffer panel, or if you're just looking for a reason to buy a raised panel cutter, this is a great reason. All right. So now I'm just going to set up, since I've got these marked, and I make the first cut on all those ends, and then I have to move this fence back to make the second cut. And of course, I'm going to use my test piece. Make sure I don't mess it up. I do need to get this key out of the test piece. All right, here we go. Well, first of all, I am really glad I marked all those because it got confusing as all get out for me, and I've done it a lot. The other thing that I didn't explain is, you make half the cuts from one side and half from the other, but because this is machined so precisely, they line up very, very well. It is super important, just like with a miter saw, where you don't want to have any dust or anything against that fence. You got to make sure that that piece is nice and tight against there. It's got to line up with this plate to really get an accurate cut. Now, there is a little bit of forgiveness, and there's one trick that I use to overcome, any little mistakes I made. All right, so let me find my test piece. Now, to get the second key in here, I'm going to move this back. I'm going to say about there's where I want to be. Let's do a test cut. So there's my second key. Now I don't want to get any closer to my groove than that, but I think that's really good. So now that I'm set up, using my X's to make sure I don't do the wrong thing, I'm going to go ahead and do the other pieces. Okay, I'm going to kind of try and hold that up. You can see how those line up really, really well when the long point's matched up. Now what I need to do is set up for the other joint that I'm going to make, and that's with the Craig jig. Now with the Craig jig, with that Hoffman machine, I'm having to make cuts in both sides. With the Craig jig, I'm just going to make cuts in one side. If you'll excuse me for a second, I'm going to go trim off this test piece because I want to make sure that when I set up the drill with the Craig jig, I've also got it lined up right. So this is a Craig micro jig, and they call it micro because it uses a smaller drill bit than the standard. The setup is still basically the same. You want to make sure that your bit is not quite hitting the jig. Don't pay attention to the color of this. This may have even been a prototype from way, way back. But the key is it's a smaller hole, so I have to use this smaller screw. Let me just pull out one. So, there is the standard screw head. And the micro, it's still got a lot of holding power, but this screw will not fit in that micro hole. And then they do have some plugs, which I'm going to show you later, that you can plug that hole. But first off, let me find my test piece. Here it is. And what I need to do, I'm going to drill these two holes. I'm drilling these two holes right here, I believe. I might drill these two. Basically, I've just got to look on my piece and see where I can get both of those holes in without causing me problems. That is one of the reasons that I went with the 2 3/4 inch wide materials. It gives me a better chance to get those two holes in. And I kind of like the bolder profile anyway, but you might be able to do this at 2.5 if you weren't going to be using the Craig. Oops, it'll work a lot better if I put the actual mitered corner over there. So what I want to make sure of is that I'm not seeing any of those holes. If I can see those holes when I drill, the drill's going to break out on this side, and that's not a good look. I am pretty sure, based on experience, that I've just got to use those two smaller holes. Again, that's part of the reason we do a test. Yeah, so if you were to follow the path of those two screws, they're going to exit about there. That's as close as I would want to be to the inside. And if you look right there, you can see, I mean, I could have scooted those two holes this way just a tiny bit, but I think that's probably the best practice, is to stay back a little bit. So, again, with the Craig machine, or the Craig jig, I don't have to do both ends. What I do need to do is find, so here's the piece that's either the top or bottom that doesn't have the Hoffman keys in it. I'm going to put it in here like so, slide it over till I can't see that hole anymore. All right, so now we're ready to go. I'll make sure there's no sawdust in there. I always put glue in this joint no matter what, and also I'm going to use a headless pin to just barely pin that long corner to make sure it holds everything in place the way I want it to be. So we get all these things out of the way except for a couple of these screws. And this is my plywood panel. My table's not perfectly smooth, so what I'm going to do is reach around here real quick and get something to put down here to protect this. And I'll also need a jig. Actually, I'm going to probably use this metal plate when I put the Craig part of the joint together. I'm going to use about a 1-inch headless pin to pin that joint together. I believe I've got a glue bottle here. All right, let me just go grab that thing to protect the door from this face, and we'll be ready to go. All right, again, now I've got to remember, put 3 corners together. Well, actually put 3 pieces together, then slide in the panel before you do the 4th one. All right. I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make that Craig joint first. So it's going to go together like so. I'm going to start out by putting some glue in the joint. Man, is this glue bottle stopped up. There's a little pro trick for you. Just beat the end of your glue. Whoa! Glue bottle. All right. Now I'm just going to let this end hang out a little bit so I can see what I'm doing, but also try I can get right at that long point. I'm making sure my fingers are far away from where that pin's going. Put a couple headless pins in there to lock that corner in. Now I'm going to take this, put the clamping pressure, whoops, that's more. The clamping pressure real close to where the screws are going to go in. Now I'm just going to drive in these screws. And it's important not to overdrive them. But that's a pretty good tight joint. Just a tiny bit of sanding and I'm going to have a great joint. Again, I'm going to need to plug these 2 holes. Matter of fact, I might as well plug the holes right now because I don't want, from now on I'm going to try and protect this face so I don't make any more sanding than I have to. But These are the small, and these say paint grade. I think they probably make them in other things too, all different kinds of wood, but they're designed to go in that hole to plug it. So I'm going to just put a good bit of glue around it and wipe off what I don't need when I'm through. Just slide them in like so. Now, once that has a chance to dry, I'm going to come back and sand the back. I'm going to sand all this. But from here on out, we're working on the back. Let me grab a handful of Hoffman keys. Got to keep remembering to put glue in there. Maybe not quite as much glue as I put in there the first time. I'm going to hit these points. And I think I'm going to still want to put one headless pin in there if I can. Just kind of lock that point in. Now take the Hoffman key, put it right there. Just drive it in flush. Okay, now this is the point when you want to make sure that you get your panel in. I wish I could say that I had never gotten in a hurry and forgotten to put the panel in, but that's not the case. All right. I don't know if you can see or not, but there's just a little bit of a gap there, and that's what shows me that I've got some breathing room around my panel together. Little glue here again, and I'm definitely going to drive this key in first, since that's the one that was already in my set position. Actually, I'll probably go ahead and make this joint up first, back over here. As long as I've got the long points lining up, I should be in pretty good shape. Just one headless pin to hold it a little bit. Couple keys. I'll spin around here. Man, I love that. That's lining up really well. So this one might be off just a tiny bit, but because I pinned the corner and I drove in the one that was set up right, it's in good shape. So here's what the finished door looks like, and as I always like to say, that's not bad for homemade. Again, one of the things I really like about this is that, you know, the Hoffman machine, certainly a lot of people don't have, but about anybody could afford to buy that Craig micro jig or have a domino. The domino's a little bit pricey also, or a biscuit joiner, but there's several ways you could put this together. Now, the last thing I want to do, since this had time to dry, I want to sand this joint on the back and just real carefully sand the front just a tiny bit. Now the thing you want to be careful about, I don't want to over sand on this front, because if I get too aggressive sanding this front, I'm going to hit this bead. There's actually a little tool that I've got that'll let me get closer to that. I'm probably going to share it. But first, let's do the heavy lifting and sand the back. So, you know, the way that I always check things is if I can't see it and I can't feel it, then it's going to be fine once it's painted. You know, those plugs have done a good job filling it. You know, if it was stain grade, you know, you could probably get by with if this was put in an oak plug or whatever. again, it's not, well, I don't know. Some people might say that looks better than the keys in there. But at any rate, the next thing I want to do is I'm going to sand this front just a little bit. I've got one crack here, and this is a great lesson. Just the tiniest little crack right there. I mean, it's just barely a hairline. But I'm going to put a little bit of glue in that and then sand it, and you won't see that crack anymore. Might be just a tiny bit there, but those joints are pretty tight. Now I want to be careful that I don't get out there and hit that bead on the outside. If I do hit the bead, and I've done that before, so I know that, I can take some hand sandpaper and kind of touch it up. Okay, this is where we had that tiny crack, and I sure don't feel it, and I'm guessing you probably can't see it. And the good news is that glue mixes with the sawdust, it'll actually stain okay. The secret is rub the glue into the crack and then wipe off everything that you possibly can, but while the glue's still wet, sand it. I'm going to hit this other joint real quick. So that's got me probably 95% sanded. There's one more thing I want to show you real quick before we jump off this and go on to something else, and that's a little bit detail sander that'll get in here and sand right out to the corner. I'm going to just jump over there and grab it real quick. Not bad, is it? Or as I like to say, that ain't bad for homemade. Are we ready? Ready. So this is the sander that I'm talking about. It's just a little detail sander. It's got this triangular pad, and what that lets me do, it's got a small orbit, but I mean I can sand right up into the corners. Right here, you probably can't even see it, but I've got like the slightest bit of an offset there, so I'm going to get in there. And so just like that, now I've got a joint I can't even feel. Now it is possible also, you can take a multi-tool like this, and they make some sanding pads that you can add on to it. You can do basically the same thing, but I've really enjoyed having this small sander. It's got the right orbit, and it'll let me get in those tight spots. Of course, just like anything, you need to blend it out or run over the whole thing. But I'm hoping that you've enjoyed watching this video. I'm hoping you're saying, man, I'd love to make that door. It's really, really simple. So what I'd like to ask you to do is, if you've enjoyed this, subscribe to my channel, my YouTube channel, and share it with some friends.